Hello, welcome to the second part of my Typescript tutorial in which I'm going to show you how to create a lazy loader library. So I hope you watched the first video in which I laid out how the project setup can be done. So I showed you my Typescript boilerplate, which I also use throughout this tutorial. So if you haven't watched the first video to get an overview over this boilerplate, how to set it up. And here we're going to jump right into how to code this lazy loading library. And first of all, as a prerequisite, it would be ideal if you already know some object-oriented JavaScript, so ES6 with classes, or any other language which is object-oriented, which supports classes. So you better understand the concepts. So yeah, let's start right away. So this is the structure which you get by using the boilerplate. And what I like to do first, I create some folders here inside the source just to have a little bit of order. So I will create a folder interfaces, and that's a concept which TypeScript supports. So you can define interfaces, which makes it easy to reduce the dependencies between different components or container components you create. I use them a lot to avoid strong coupling. Then what I also want to create is a components folder, which is where I'll put different components I use. And then what I also want to create up in the top folder of the project, a demo folder. And this is where I put some demo homepage, which we're going to use to test the lazy loading. And I'm going to start with this because it also lines out how or what kind of an interface I want to use. So it's a bit of a top-down approach where I start with the test page, then I define the interface, and then I go downwards, versus you could do a complete analysis of what you want to build, so requirements and everything, and then start from the bottom up really with the small components. But here for such smaller projects, I find it's the faster way to start at the top. So first think about how you want to use your library, and you best do this by creating a demo page which represents some real page where you want to use that library, and then decide how you need to configure it, what kind of interface you want your library to have, which makes it easy to use later on. So let's create a lazy HTML here, and I'm gonna copy over the code from the real project, so I already have this demo page. So we have a very simple HTML page where I define some styles here up at the top. So I have a container div which has a width of 960 pixels. I center it horizontally, and then I have a selector for all the images which are direct children of that container. And I define some margin between the images. And down here you see the structure. So we have 6 images which are in this container. Then we have a script tag which already loads this MeBrite lazy loader min.js from the dist folder. So if you run npm run build or also npm run build dev, those are 2 of the commands which are set up in the boilerplate. They will create a library and place it in the dist folder. Now currently this library is empty because we haven't written any code yet, but I already loaded here, and later there's a second script tag. This is where we're gonna use whatever code we write in that library to do the lazy loading. But first let's have a look at how this page currently works. So if I load it, you see there are the 6 images, one beneath the other. And if we press F12, we go to the developer tools and can do some simulation here in the network tab. So I disable the cache and set it to fast 3G, and now when I reload, you see that all the 6 images are loaded at once. So although I just see this one image and I haven't scrolled down yet, all the images will be already requested. Now this is not ideal because some user might just go to your page, look at the top 2 images maybe, and then go to the next page. So he wouldn't need to load all the other images. And this creates traffic which is unnecessary, and also which makes your page load slower. So you want to avoid that. And this is why we want to do some lazy loading now. So there are different ways to do lazy loading. There's one attribute which you can use, loading, and you set this to lazy. So if you put this into an image tag, this is supported by the modern browsers, and this will also help you avoid unnecessary image loads. So it should only load images once they are visible. But what we're going to do, we're not use this. We want to create a flexible library which we can configure a bit more. And what we're going to do is, a typical way to create lazy loading is to use the current source. So we have here this source. And instead of having it as a source, we do data minus source. So we create it as a data source. Now, if we look at the page, none of the images will be loaded, and we've created invalid HTML code. So for images, you always have to specify a source. And yeah, a typical way to do that is to create a 1 pixel image, which you just use as a placeholder. And I've already put here into the images the image placeholder transparent PNG file. And yeah, this is just a 1 pixel image. And the advantage of having it like this is I can now provide a source here in the images. And I have this point to this placeholder. And now if we look at the page, we have proper HTML because every image has a source, but we don't see the images yet. The advantage of having it like this is you can have 40, 50 images. They all load the same placeholder, so it will just be one single request, and afterwards the placeholder will come from the cache, so you don't create redundant HTTP requests, and also it's very small and will be loaded very quickly. Now, how lazy loading libraries usually work: once you want to load an image, what you do, you take the content of the data source and put it into the source. And once you exchange it, the image will be loaded. And what we're gonna do is we define now our interface for the library to be able to first just tell it which image number we want to load, and then later we also implement a so-called scroll loader. So only if an image appears on the page will it be loaded. Yeah, and as said, we wanted to start at the top, so let's go to the index and first create a factory method, which we put as the default export in the index.ts file. And this will be a function which takes an element selector. So basically we could give this as an element as selector, saying, okay, give me all the images within the container. And we also want to provide some kind of a config. And I like to use configs within Typescript because first of all, I can easily extend them throughout the project. So I don't need to add more and more parameters to a function call. And also I can do some checks. So I'll write a checker for this config. And yeah, what you see here in the end, this is iLazyLoader, that's an interface. And we're gonna start by specifying or defining this interface. So let's go to the interfaces, put the iLazyLoader TS file, and I just prepend interfaces always with I because it's a nice convention to instantly tell me that's an interface. And in TypeScript, you can simply define interface by doing export default interface and now give it the name iLazyLoader. So it's similar to a class definition, except that we're just going to put in function definitions now without any function body. And yeah, one function we want to have for our lazy loader, I already hinted at that. I want to be able to load a specific element. So I'm gonna put this function here. I call it load element. It gets an index. And now this is one thing why I like TypeScript a lot. First, you can define interfaces. And second, it's strongly typed. So you can define types, versus when you use JavaScript, you cannot directly define types, so your transpiler or compiler cannot do error checks for you. And if you write a big library, this can become quite of a problem. So there are alternatives. So if you're coming from the React.js world, Flow.js is used widely, but I personally like to directly use TypeScript here because it's directly integrated into the Visual Studio Code IDE. You have very good tooling around it. Yeah, and it really helps you to find bugs in your code very early, because for JavaScript, what you often have to check is just, okay, if whatever you pass to a function, is it really a number or could it be something else? Because it can be. Also with TypeScript, you could pass anything, but the compiler will tell you. And I'm going to show you this later. Now here, this says it takes an index, which is a number, and then you also define the return type. And in this case, this loading of an image, that's an asynchronous process. So I said when I exchange this source against the data source, the image will be loaded. This is done not in the main thread. So the browser takes over, fetches the image data, and then he will call back into the main loop. And this is why we can use a promise here and wait for that promise. So we say, okay, we want to return a promise, and once it's resolved, it will give us a Boolean. And this Boolean could be true if it's loaded, or false for some reason didn't load the image. So that's a very simple interface to start with. Now let's get back to the index. And now if you go or hover over this iLazyLoader, you see still the red squiggly lines. But now we already have a quick fix available here. And this quick fix is now import the iLazyLoader from the model interfaces lazyloader. So that's quite nice. What we still have to define is the lazyloader config. And we're gonna do this directly up here in this file and also export it. And what this is gonna be is a type. This is another concept of TypeScript. And for now, we will not yet put anything in here. So I just create this as a placeholder for now. Here we're gonna define how the lazy loading will work later on. But here you still have some squiggly lines because we don't create a lazy loader yet. Now, to create a lazy loader, we cannot just create an interface. So return new iLazyLoader will not work because it's not a real class, so you can't instantiate it. So what we're gonna have to do with an interface, we have to implement it. Now this will happen up in the components. So here we're gonna create the lazy loader. And this lazy loader will be a class, lazy loader, which implements the iLazyLoader interface. You see, it already automatically imported it. And now here, squiggly lines, it tells us we still have to implement this interface. And you can also do the quick fix quickly. It will create a dummy, a stub method, which will currently throw an error. So that's the load element method. And now you have a fully implemented lazy loader. Now if we go back to the index, again, let's quickly import it. First of all, we should not create the iLazyLoader, but the lazy loader here. And now we're gonna use the quick fix again and import it. And yeah, this is the rough structure for our lazy loader now. It currently doesn't do anything other than when we call this load element of the interface, it will throw an arrow, but that's okay for now. We just wanted to lay out the project. Now, if I build it and we now go to the minified library, you see that here we now have this class lazyLoader in pure JavaScript. And down here, somewhere, here's our create method. But yeah, currently here's a problem. It has this Webpack default export tag. And if you want to use such a library inside of an HTML page, you should use named exports because then you can directly call those functions. So here in the index, instead of having a default export, we give this function name, create lazy loader. Now we build again, have a quick look, and you see down here, that's the function create lazy loader. Now if we go to the HTML, down here in the script tag, we can directly use that function. For this is important here in this project info.js, which I showed in the first video. Here you define the minified library name. So we have to use this here. And within this library, we now have the create lazy loader function, which takes as the first argument the selector, so container image, and as a second argument the configuration, which currently is just an empty object. Now if we go to the page and have a look, we currently see nothing. So what we should do, let's const loader, so let's assign the returned loader to this loader variable, and now we call the method loader.loadElement. We just say, yeah, load the first element. And now if we call it again, you see here on-called error, method not implemented. And that's exactly what we specified, that currently this method throws an exception. So here, method not implemented. This is what we currently get. So we now have implemented the shell for our lazy loader, but we have not filled in any meaningful logic here. So I think this is going to be part of the next tutorial. Currently, I just wanted to lay out again how to set up this project and how you basically export functions to be later used inside of HTML, how you specify the name of the library, which you do here in the project info.js. So this was already part of the first tutorial also. So here this minified library name, that's important. Via this you can call the different functions you export in this index. Yeah, we talked about interfaces, we talked about types, also the strong typing in TypeScript. And in the next video, we're gonna fill in the functionality and discover a few more concepts of TypeScript and also see why it's very helpful.